The ruins whispered in dead air. Commander Tavrek Dolan stepped through the fractured archway, careful not to disturb the fine grey powder that coated everything. It clung to boots, to gloves, to the breath if you weren't careful. Dust that once had a name, a city, a people, now reduced to silence and sediment. He didn't speak. None of the crew did. Yorick Theta was supposed to be a routine survey. Confirm mining eligibility, log terrain, sample rock composition, and move on. The world had been flagged long ago as cleansed, though no one could say exactly what that meant. Dolan had read the line in the mission brief and moved past it. He wished he hadn't. Their scanner drone had found the buried shell by accident, beneath layers of sterilized soil and scorched bedrock, deep inside what looked like an artificial valley. What remained of a city slouched there in broken geometry, the kind of collapse that doesn't come from time or nature, but deliberate, sweeping force. The sort meant to bury a memory. Dolan knelt beside a crushed structure that once resembled a plaza, hands steady, breath tight inside his helmet. The reconstruction module hovered nearby, cycling through a corrupted cache of recovered fragments. It was a stretch of luck finding anything at all. Whoever had wiped this place had been thorough. The images started faint, just shadows and flickers, faint outlines of a settlement, foreign script on stone, skeletal infrastructure. Nothing strange. Then, too suddenly, the images began to shift. Not ruins, not echoes, bodies. A rows of upright figures, arms bound, backs exposed to light. The positioning was unmistakable. Not random, systematic. Deliberate execution staging. Dolan's throat tightened, but he said nothing. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Telvin, hovered behind him, silent as well. As more fragments aligned, the picture grew worse. Timestamped stills showed progressive stages of clearing, flattening, sterilization. These weren't the remains of war. They were the aftermath of a cull, organized, sanitized, and hidden under geological reshaping. Dolan stood slowly. He'd seen enough. He looked toward the transport parked along the ridge, a silver scar against the red stone horizon. Kestrel 9. A lean survey ship not built for confrontation, and certainly not for the kind of discovery they'd made. He didn't need a full analysis. He didn't want one. He'd seen similar patterns in old Terran reports from darker centuries, images of internment camps and erased villages. This wasn't history. This was buried policy. Selvin finally broke the silence. "Commander, what do we do with this?" Dolan didn't answer right away. He looked toward the low sun as it flickered through the haze, catching the edges of fractured glass towers long swallowed by the dust. Then he turned and began walking back toward the ship. "We send it home." The crew followed, quiet and alert, boots whispering across ash. Inside the Kestrel's tight command bay, Dolan bypassed the Council's relay protocols and accessed Earth's deep network. It wasn't standard, but they had fallback channels, legacy routes from a time when Earth was less trusted, more cautious, outdated, forgotten. That made them perfect. The data was encrypted and embedded in a redundant signal, then pushed through low-priority telemetry under agricultural survey tags. It wasn't elegant, but it would reach someone, Orin maybe. Someone who would know what they were looking at. The moment the message was away, Dolan felt his muscles unclench for the first time in hours. He didn't believe in prayer, but he believed in motion. Getting the truth off this planet was the only thing that mattered. 12 minutes later, everything stopped. The lights in the ship dimmed without warning. Monitors dropped to static. Environmental hums faded into eerie, brittle silence. It wasn't a systems failure. Nothing sparked, nothing broke. Everything simply ceased. Dolan snapped toward the controls. "Talk to me." "We've lost uplink. No navsync. No beacons," Telvin said. panic bleeding into his voice. "Commander, they cut us off." Dolan didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the dead comms panel. The Council had seen the message. They hadn't asked questions. They hadn't opened dialogue. They'd moved straight to silence. He leaned forward, speaking low and steady. "Emergency Protocol 88. Total broadcast quarantine." The realization settled like ice. No warnings, no formal accusations, no diplomacy, just blackout. Telvin turned. "They're isolating Earth. They're scrubbing the message," Duran said, "and anyone who knows it exists." Outside the ship, the sun dipped further behind Jorak Theta's fractured moons. In that half-light, the ruins looked more like graves than structures, as if the world had been dressed for a funeral long before they arrived. Back on Earth, the blackout rolled in like fog. Cities across continents stared at blinking error screens. News feeds jammed, orbital platforms ceased weather projections, commercial ships reported full signal loss and were ordered to dock. The Terran communication network, once a chaotic, decentralized web, had gone quiet. People noticed. They always did. Silence was louder than news. Broadcast agencies speculated about solar storms or relay malfunctions. Politicians issued half-hearted reassurance. Engineers checked systems that weren't broken. Across Earth's networks, the same grey banner appeared, translated into a dozen tongues. External transmission suspended, cause containment, duration undisclosed. No one knew what it meant, not yet. But somewhere out in deep space, on a ship hovering above a graveyard planet, Tavrik Donan sat in the dark, staring at a dead screen. He wasn't angry. He was remembering. Not the faces, not the names. Those had already been taken. He was remembering the rows, the silence, the meticulousness. And he knew now what silence really meant. It wasn't peace. It was preparation. The storm over Nebraska had no thunder, just wind-like breath held too long. The farm bot in Sector 12 hadn't moved in 6 years. Not since the last soil shift rerouted the irrigation lines. Its steel casing was pitted, its solar strip warped, and its diagnostic logs long declared it obsolete. Yet tonight, beneath a field of rusted cornstalks and a sky drained of stars, it stirred. No alert was issued, no blinking lights. The machine simply rotated once, locked its broken frame into alignment, and aimed its lens at nothing. In the control tower, 300 miles away, a technician named Meyer sipped cold coffee and stared at a screen that shouldn't have lit up. He rubbed his eyes once. The signal was faint, buried under decades of electromagnetic rot. But it was there, layered like sediment, encoded inside a low-priority soil acidity feed. "Sector 12's awake," he muttered. His supervisor leaned over. "12's been dead since the Concord flood." "Then explain this." The screen flickered with raw feed, no sound, no telemetry markers, just shapes moving through static. Then came frames they couldn't explain. Metal poles, the bent posture of unknown bodies, long dead terrain under brutal light. The footage shouldn't have existed. It certainly shouldn't have reached Earth. Someone upstream had cracked protocol, and someone else had been ready for it. Far beneath the surface of Lake Geneva, buried below layers of false foundations and outdated civil records, the Orn Command Corps flickered awake. There was no panic, no lights, no alarms, only a soft hum that hadn't been heard in 20 years, and a quiet voice in a quiet room saying, "We've got a ghost." The signal had piggybacked through buried latticework, bouncing off orbital weather satellites no one had remembered existed. It threaded through retired military drones, still floating in orbit as educational props, and reactivated ground nodes long written off as Cold War junk. There was no single path, only 1,000 threads woven like panic plant embroidery. Directive Echo. The name meant little to the civilians it had been designed to protect, but in the subterranean halls of Orin, where walls were reinforced for signal integrity more than blast resistance, the name was gospel. A legacy of engineers who didn't trust the stars, and a planet that never forgot what it felt like to be gagged. The signal pulsed once more. The last fragments came through, then the feed froze. All that remained was what had already been caught. They assembled within the hour. Null Assembly wasn't a government. It wasn't military either. It was something older, hidden between the words of every public treaty Earth had signed since first contact, a council of planners and skeptics who believed that diplomacy didn't always end in conversation, that sometimes power didn't ask. It corrected. They sat in darkness, watching the recovered footage replay across a matte black screen. Broken pillars, figures arranged in death, not killed, managed. The room stayed silent for a full minute after the final frame. Then the voice at the end of the table, calm, tired, with that old Terran accent that sounded like it belonged to stone, spoke. "Do we know the ship?" "Kestrel 9, someone replied. "Out of Luna's North Belt Station, Commander Tavrek Dolan, survey mission." "And how did he get this out?" "Telemetry disguise, agricultural cover channel, spliced under pre-sanitized Earthside soil data." The old voice almost smiled. "Clever bastard." No one asked if the footage was real. The rhythms were too clean, the angles too specific. No artificial rendering mimicked loss that well. Another member leaned forward. "If the Council silenced us this fast, they're not panicking. They're preparing." "No," came the first reply. "They're burying, just like they did with those species." The table fell quiet again. Not out of fear, out of familiarity. This wasn't a surprise, it was confirmation. In a hidden server vault above the chamber, relay engineers began uncoiling the lattice. Directive Echo had slept for decades, maintained in simulation but never triggered. Built not for war, but for blockade. A signal fortress made of bones and forgotten wires. At first, only a dozen satellites blinked awake. Then 100. Then thousands. Some hadn't been registered in orbit since the second expansion. They didn't need to be fast. They didn't even need to be efficient. They only needed to exist outside the Council's surveillance architecture. In the background, across Earth's civilian systems, power grids received subtle pings. Lights in certain districts dimmed for no reason. Not enough to draw attention. Enough to sink. Earth's entire infrastructure had once been layered with mesh-based redundancy, designed by paranoid architects who didn't believe the stars would always be friendly. Now, those architects were smiling in their graves. In the eastern provinces, abandoned towers blinked once, tiny red dots in unpopulated zones. In western mountain ranges, forgotten relay dishes began to turn, slow and stiff like old dogs stretching in the cold. Everything was waking up. Meanwhile, deep inside Orin's vault, a decision was made. Earth would not scream. It would respond. And it would do so like a machine remembering its design. Back aboard Kestrel 9, Dolan sat in silence. They'd tried patching back into the Council's mesh, but every node was a mirror now. Signals bounced back in loops, tracking only their own footprints. It was like shouting inside a locked chamber, hearing only yourself, the kind of silence engineered to break minds. Telvin looked at him from across the deck. "Do you think they got it?" Dolan's eyes didn't leave the black screen. "They got enough." He tapped a slow rhythm on the arm of his chair. His hands, once used to star charts and mineral reports, now sat idle in the middle of something older. Not a war, not yet, but something colder, more precise. He wasn't angry, not anymore. He was watching, because somewhere down on Earth, they were watching too. And soon someone would answer. The chamber smelled like old paper and colder air. The Null Assembly hadn't used this vault in years. Not because it wasn't functional, but because very few situations ever demanded it. The walls were lined not with servers or screens, but with shelves. Actual printed treaties, archived by hand. Buried beneath a mountain in the Canadian Shield, the vault was shielded from everything, sensors, signals, and sometimes even memory. They called it the Citadel. It wasn't meant for war councils. It was meant for ghosts, specifically legal ghosts. 5 members stood hunched around a wide table littered with folios so ancient they creaked when opened. Lines of dry ink traced long-forgotten compromises, interspecies conventions, signed in moments of crisis or misplaced trust. Some were ceremonial, most were irrelevant, but not all. "They're calling it containment," said General Adari, scanning the room. "Emergency Protocol 88 isn't new. It was designed after the Sidari uprising to prevent religious uprisings from going viral." "This isn't an uprising," muttered Sarah Venn, the lead diplomatic historian. "This is a suppression." The footage from Jarek Theta hadn't been questioned. The method of its delivery, however, had sparked fury across council channels. Earth was being framed not as a truth-teller, but a cultural saboteur. That was their angle now. Unauthorized subspace disruption. The message was being twisted. But Earth still had one card left to play. "I've found it," said Venn. The room fell still. She didn't say it twice. She turned the folio toward them, her finger pressed to a clause buried in the 4th Annex of the Unified Cultural Agreements, ratified after the Neralos Reformation Wars. The words were clear and the implications sharp enough to draw blood. Convention 17A. All recognized council participants are permitted uninterrupted cultural transmission and ritual observance, regardless of political status, conflict, or censure, for a minimum window of 300 seconds per cycle. Adari exhaled slowly. "That's ceremonial fluff. It was meant to protect things like chant casts or mourning hymns." "It doesn't say what content qualifies," Venn replied, "only that it be culturally encoded and publicly transmitted. The clause is still binding. They've never repealed it." "Because no one's ever weaponized it," said another voice from the end of the table. His eyes turned toward Minister Rav, who rarely spoke unless a decision was being sealed. "Well," he said, "perhaps it's time someone did." In the tunnels beneath the assembly, engineers were already moving. They called it Project Pharos, a signal relay concept that had been mothballed years ago for being too unstable. It was based on ancient relay node technology, salvaged from an old Council satellite crash in the asteroid belt. That node had been torn open during Earth's first contact window, an accidental event no one admitted to, but everyone remembered. It hadn't broadcast in the traditional sense. It had lashed, like a flare gun through fog. The mechanism behind it had been disassembled, studied, and shelved. It was unreliable, uncontrollable. But in this case, unpredictability was exactly what Earth needed. "You're not building a channel," Adari told the team. "You're cracking a door open and hurling fire through it." The head engineer, a thin man named Halden, didn't look up from his terminal. "We only need 4 minutes and 30 seconds. 3-minute number." Halden looked up this time, because that's the average duration the Council's passive relay grid collapses into manual fallback during a magnetic spike from Jupiter. They stared at him. "You mean solar activity?" "No, I mean Jupiter itself. Every 19 years, the magnetic field destabilizes just enough to cause a harmonic stutter across subspace net relays positioned in orbital drift." "And when's the next one?" Halden turned the screen toward them. 73 hours. Earth didn't make announcements. There were no orders, no flashing headlines, no speeches from presidents or ministers. Instead, things shifted, quietly, across mirror colonies. Those fringe outposts left off the Council's map, but bound to Earth by trust rather than paperwork. Messages arrived without header or preamble. Encrypted, short, blunt. Blackout protocol confirm sync, prepare local replay loops. In domed settlements on Titan's Edge and asteroid belt biospheres, community leaders nodded and passed instructions down the line. Local feeds were cleared, power grids adjusted. Emergency channels, long repurposed for weather alerts and agricultural drones, were tested and aligned. They weren't told what would be broadcast, only that when the time came, they were to show it everywhere and let no one speak. In cities across Earth, the preparation took stranger forms. Streetlights dimmed a little earlier than usual, not enough to alarm, just enough to make people glance up. Old maintenance tunnels beneath the capital's metro lines lit up for the first time in decades. Their contents, fiber rigs and projectors disguised as flood control systems, were tested and synced, then locked. In primary school districts, classroom screens were checked and left on standby. In churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, every digital bulletin board received silent background packets. No content, just readiness. Even in prisons and hospitals, backup power systems were inspected, not by government agents, but janitors, volunteers, nurses, people who'd received nothing but a phrase passed in plain words. If the lights go out, hold up your screen. No one asked why. I didn't need to. Inside Orin's central hub, Dolan's stream was reviewed again. Not just the genocide footage, but his embedded overlays, the time-stamped terrain data, and the closing sequence he'd included without prompt. A single frame showing his crew standing beneath the glass archway on Joric Theta, expressionless, the bones of a dead species behind them. The signal had no narration. It didn't need one. It showed. They loaded it into 6 relay vaults, each one assigned to a different mirror colony. If one failed, another would trigger. If 2 failed, the signal would cascade through Earth's dormant education network. It was a plan with too many variables. It relied on failure windows, ancient treaties, and an orbital timing event no one could fully model. But it was the only shot they had. As the countdown began, the null assembly met one final time. They reviewed the clause again, just to be sure. One line of language. Never amended, never challenged, passed with good intentions by civilizations long extinct. Now it would carry the memory of extinction again, but this time broadcast by those who refused to be erased. In the final hour before deployment, the cities went dark. Not all at once, not in panic, just enough to thicken the silence. Somewhere, far above, in the orbit of Jupiter, the pulse had already begun. And across Earth, in the quiet before signal, you could almost hear it. The pause before a scream. It began with the streetlights. At first no one noticed. A flicker here, a dimming there. Lights that usually hummed steadily through the night blinked in strange patterns. 3 short pulses, 2 long. In downtown Karachi, they rippled in waves down the avenue like a silent Morse code. In old towns across Europe, they dimmed just enough for people to notice, but not enough to call anyone. It felt like a system hiccup, the kind of thing the electric companies usually blamed on grid balancing, but it wasn't. It was a signal, and it was being read by those who were meant to see it. In a rural village in Argentina, a farmer looked up from tending his crops to find a man in plain clothes handing him a tablet. "What is this?" "When the lights go out," the stranger said. "Hold it up. That's all." The farmer turned the screen over. It had no interface, no branding, nothing except a single hard switch on the back. When he flipped it on, the screen went black, save for a blinking white dot. Waiting. Listening. In the outskirts of Kyoto, teachers were told to cancel the afternoon lessons. No reason, just a time and a location. The children were packed into vans, buses, and unmarked cars, driven to reinforced shelters hidden beneath libraries, old subway stations, and even beneath a tea shop that hadn't been open in 20 years. No one said the word emergency. They simply handed out headphones, snacks, and tablets. In a crowded slum in Lagos, community organizers who hadn't worked together in years met in silence behind an abandoned shipping yard. They distributed projectors and portable reflectors wrapped in old canvas. They gave no speeches, only instructions. Aim up, play the footage when the lights fall, and don't speak. The orders came from no flag. No leader took credit, no country claimed ownership. It wasn't about that anymore. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a memory being primed for ignition. Inside Orin's core vault, deep below Geneva, a wall of silent timers ticked towards zero. There was no sound in the room, just the faint hum of bodies holding their breath. General Adari stood with his arms crossed, watching as each sub-network turned green. Power reroutes, city relay overrides, atmospheric lensing nodes, all syncing. Each one confirmed, not by flashy holograms, but by faint lights on an old board, the kind that required hands to build and eyes to monitor. Minister Rav stood behind him. How many? 17 major cities. Dozens more on partial coverage. 6 colonies confirmed and locked. And civilian compliance? They're ready. They don't know what they're showing yet, but they trust us. Rav nodded. That trust had been the last thing they thought they'd still have. On board Kestrel 9, Tavrak Dolan sat at the narrow desk built into the crew's communications alcove. The ship was silent now, not dead, just waiting. He leaned forward, activated the visual recorder, and stared into the lens. He didn't bother with rank or formality. If you're seeing this, then you already know what's been done. You've seen the soil soaked in silence, the species erased not by war but by policy, sanitized, removed, forgotten. His voice didn't rise. He wasn't preaching. They will say we lied, that what we found was fabricated. They'll paint it as disruption, sabotage. They always do. They'll accuse Earth of being dangerous, unstable, unworthy of Council trust. But they won't show what we found. He paused. Because if they do, you'll know. And if you know, so will others. Dolan looked away for a moment, then back into the camera. They'll silence you. Speak anyway. He tapped the console once. The message compressed and joined the embedded signal file. That was all he could do now. The rest would fall to a world that had learned how to speak in darkness. Across Earth, the countdown reached its final hours. In every neighborhood, the blackout alerts came without warning. Phones vibrated at the same time. No text, no voice, just a symbol, a dim square with a circle in the center. Most people didn't understand it. But those who had lived through Earth's long years of political chaos and colonization, those who still remembered the brownouts during orbital sanction drills, understood immediately. The lights weren't going out from failure. They were being called off. Apartment buildings went quiet. High-rises powered down rooftop billboards. Even spaceports dimmed their docking indicators, the giant guidance systems flickering red once, then vanishing into night. A quiet city is unnatural, but a planet-wide hush? That was something else entirely. Families gathered on rooftops with battery-powered screens. Some used old projection drones repurposed from wedding ceremonies and school plays. Others simply opened windows and held devices to the sky. In slums and suburbs alike, in deserts and forests, by beaches and highland ridges, everywhere human hands could reach, a glow began to form. Not loud, not blinking, just present. In the mirror colonies, those scattered moons and air-sheltered bases orbiting unclaimed stars, the silence was even deeper. They didn't have skylines or power grids to dim, but they had screens and people. Children in oxygen domes sat wrapped in blankets, watching parents ready the displays. In a mining outpost on Valen Spire, 100 workers paused their drills, gathered near the comms post, and waited. Not because they were told to, because someone had asked, and they believed the reason would matter. Back on Earth, an old woman in Ukraine lit a candle in her window before powering down the rest of her flat. She remembered her father doing the same in the last blackout decades ago when the stars had been foreign and distant. She didn't know what was coming, only that the world was about to show something it wasn't supposed to remember. As the final moments ticked away across oceans and continents in orbit and beneath soil, humanity held its breath. The planet didn't shine that night. It glowed, not with electricity or banners or noise, with billions of silent points of light, screens, projectors, reflections, held high like fireflies caught in the hands of people who refused to forget. And high above, in the dark corridor between Jupiter's breath and the Council's blind spot, a signal began to gather force. It would not be loud, but it would be seen. And that, for now, was enough. 318 Earth Standard Time. The flux began like a breath held too long. Above the swirling red eye of Jupiter, the planet's massive magnetic field cracked inward for a brief, mathematically predictable moment. A harmonics collapse that had been charted by Earth's forgotten scientists decades ago and ignored by the rest of the galaxy. For 9 seconds, the core Council relay grid faltered. Redundancy networks blinked into manual fall, and Earth moved. From orbit over Mars, a pulse leapt across the void, a sharpened spear of data wrapped in rituals and raw proof. Project Pharos fired from 6 buried nodes, each split-second coordinated, each one aimed not at a target, but at blind spots in the Council's watchtower network. It wasn't a transmission, it was a rupture. Across hundreds of worlds, screens lit where they weren't supposed to. On Talvar, a bureaucratic stronghold in the Core 3, the morning broadcast was interrupted mid-announcement. The Minister of Commerce had been halfway through a report on interspecies energy cooperation when the holoscreen behind her blurred. Static replaced her face. A single frame jolted through, then another. On the Hiral capital moon, temples went dark mid-prayer. Worshippers rose from the floor, blinking at the sudden appearance of images not their own. On Zurin's orbiting education ring, classrooms fell into chaos as teaching modules were replaced by still frames of sterilized valleys. The footage was raw. There was no narrator, no transition, no filter. Just truth. The cracked world, Jurek, its surface a scar of glass and ash. Ruined cities, slaughtered structures that had once been homes. Excavation fields lined with thin poles, some still upright, some toppled and half-buried in grey dirt. Faces, non-human, peaceful, gone. Then documents. Blunt, brutal, orders dated and countersigned, not once, dozens of times. Every one of them bore seals from council marshals. Across those same screens, the footage shifted, not into silence, but into now. Live feeds bled into the display, split-screened alongside the genocide evidence. Earth cities, dark and still, rooftops illuminated not by infrastructure, but by handheld light. Tablets, drones, projectors, all synchronized in the same glowing rhythm. No sound, no slogans, no speeches. Just billions of human beings, holding up the truth. The council systems panicked. Inside the relay control towers orbiting Sagari Prime, technicians scrambled to override local feeds, the signal rerouted before they could finish. One tried to sever it from the root node, only to discover the route had never been registered. Another sent an AI command to jam all non-authorized broadcasts. The AI tried, failed, tried again, then locked. The signal wasn't being fed into the system. It had been built into it. Back on Earth, silence reigned. From the Arctic research domes to the coastal slums of Southeast Asia, no one spoke. Even children seemed to understand. In Rio, 2 elderly women stood shoulder to shoulder on their rooftops, screens raised in brittle hands. In Nairobi, a hospital janitor paused mid-mopping, turned off the corridor lights, and pointed her phone at the ceiling. In Beijing, a crowd of thousands gathered in Tiananmen Square. every screen angled upward like mirrors to a forgotten sky. In rural France, an old resistance fighter wept softly as the signal played across the stone wall of his barn, projected from a repurposed drone his grandson had once used for farming. No one told them what to do. They just knew. 4 minutes and 31 seconds. That was all. The council by then had switched to emergency protocol. Local administrators were given the green light to dismiss the footage as a hack, to tell the citizens that Earth had doctored the evidence, that this was propaganda. But the story didn't cooperate. In the Calrin districts, known for their judicial obsession with data lineage, 3 separate AI forensics teams tried to disprove the footage. All 3 failed. The origin markers were too deep, too old. The timestamps matched. The logs matched. The terrain matched. Known historical service. On Grelic Station, a news anchor was broadcasting the council's official response when the station's own weather screen behind him switched mid-sentence to show the sterilization orders. He froze, looked into the camera, didn't finish the segment. The council's fear wasn't the footage. It was how many were watching. Back aboard Kestrel 9, Dolan sat in silence. He couldn't see Earth or the relay paths. He didn't need to. "They'll try to twist it," Talvin muttered beside him. "They'll say it's all a trick." Dolan didn't look away from the static frozen monitor. "Let them. You don't silence a lie like this. You starve it. And by then, it's too late." He closed his eyes. For a moment he saw the field again. The ash, the poles, the execution order hidden like a stain no one thought would resurface. And now, it played like prophecy on 1,000 alien worlds. At minute 4, on a council-controlled relay hub above Tarivon 4, an administrator tried to purge the footage one last time. He activated an emergency reset. The feed froze, then stuttered, then split again. This time, it showed not the genocide, but Earth. Not human speaking, not burning flags or breaking walls. Just waiting. An old man sweeping a street beneath a blackout. A child standing on a balcony with a drone hovering above her, light projecting downward. A couple lying on their apartment floor, holding a screen between them, tears pooling silently. No anger, no chant, only remembrance. And that was worse than rage. By the time the council resecured control, the damage was no longer digital. The footage had already been copied, archived, shared in encrypted fragments by citizens from species that had never met a human. In some colonies it was sent with a note. If this is false, why did they try to stop it? In others it was labeled not as news, but history. 4 minutes and 31 seconds. That's all it took. No fleets, no blood. Just light, silence, and the truth held high enough to be seen. They tried to put the fire out with fabric soaked in oil. Within minutes of the signal ending, the council's command servers began purging. Files, frames, timestamps, scrubbed in mass deletions disguised as network maintenance. The footage of Jorak Theta was flagged as synthetic disinformation, repackaged under Category 7 visual tampering. Council-wide directives ordered immediate suppression on all public-facing channels. But the signal didn't obey. It had already slipped into hands beyond control. On the education worlds of Lirin, Voxt and Runstra, neutral systems with open-source learning networks, the footage had been absorbed automatically. Their school archives ran automated sync with council data every 3 hours, cataloging major historical events. When the broadcast flared across the grid, the systems logged it as a live event and backed it up in full. 3 different school planets, 3 different time zones, 3 perfectly aligned entries. When council regulators arrived to request deletion, they were told no. "It was history," said Runestra's education minister. "Our children already saw it. You don't erase what they've already asked questions about." The council called for emergency containment, but that word, containment, had already become a trigger. It no longer sounded like safety, it sounded like silence. And silence was no longer trusted. In the spiral arms of the fringe, the reaction was louder. On Callan's Reach, a former trade colony turned research enclave, citizens demanded an independent review. Their governing council responded with full transparency. The footage would be shown again, this time accompanied by contextual evidence. Across Avalos Station, digital boards flashed with calls for accountability. Thousands gathered in the central atrium, holding candles and projectors, replaying the genocide footage on loop beside images of Earth's vigil. No shouting, just light. Then came the declarations. 11 species submitted formal petitions for tribunal hearings. 2 others, Necra and Solvan, walked away completely, resigning from the Interstellar Council after decades of membership. They cited irreconcilable ethical failures and loss of trust in foundational integrity. The Council tried to spin it. Broadcasts were issued claiming Earth had hijacked relay systems, that the footage was incomplete, and that the reaction was being manipulated through mass emotional contagion. But the more they denied it, the more eyes turned to it. The coverage couldn't be buried, not when it lived inside school archives, not when it was stored in personal devices, not when it had been carved into mural data by artists on far-off worlds. A truth that ugly doesn't die easy. It just multiplies. Back on Earth, the servers never rested. Inside Orin, engineers rotated in 6-hour shifts. Sleep was caught in corners, meals eaten without conversation. The mission wasn't over, it had only changed. "New breach detected," muttered one of the monitors. "Relay Ghost 3, someone's trying to backdoor through Mirror Colony 5. "Deny and look the address," said the supervisor. "Tag it, store the attack pattern." "They're adapting," Astro said. "So are Project Ferros had been dismantled, but the data protections had not. What Earth had sent out wasn't just a transmission, it was a chain of custody. Encrypted redundancies buried in dozens of education hubs and civic libraries, timed to release only when challenged. Try to delete it, it reappears. Try to corrupt it, a backup answers. Every interference attempt only confirmed that there was something worth hiding. They weren't protecting a message anymore. They were protecting memory. The people understood that too. In the days following the broadcast, a strange ritual began to appear across Earth's cities and outer colonies. It started in Jakarta, a small apartment window with a tablet propped up on the sill, still displaying the paused footage of Jurak Theta. Below it, a white flower in a cracked glass cup. Then came Paris. A folded paper note taped beneath a rooftop drone screen, written in a child's hand. "Remember them." Then Bogota, then Dakar, then Orbit. Screens left on overnight, glowing faintly beside offerings, candles, stones, lists of names. Some made up, some believed to belong to the species lost. Some wrote apologies. Others left nothing but silence. In Boston, someone painted an entire city wall with outlines of the execution field. No color, just shape, just void. In New Seoul, a musician stood alone in a square, playing one long note on an old wooden flute until his breath gave out. No words, no speeches, just grief, just memory. And for the first time, it wasn't human grief alone. On Vornak's diplomatic station, a former ambassador of the Urelkan Confederacy spoke before a press chamber full of alien eyes. "My people always believed humans were unstable," he said, "that you had come too far, too fast. But I watched your silence. I saw your cities hold their breath, and I saw how you held that pain, not for yourselves, but for others. That changed something in me." The feed was viewed over 70 million times across 5 systems, not because it was political, but because someone admitted being wrong. And that, in the Council's halls, was rarer than war. The Council's meetings grew bitter. Old alliances fractured, as accusations flew behind closed doors. Who authorized the sterilizations? Who signed the excavation orders? How many others had known and remained quiet? Ministers turned on ministers. Whole species blamed their delegates for the scandal. One internal vote to censure Earth failed by a single ballot. And still, the footage played. People shared it in messages without subject lines, in family groups on visual display walls in shipping ports, in the background of dance halls and synagogues and seed vaults. They didn't watch it to be shocked. They watched it to not forget. Inside, Orin, one of the younger technicians, looked up from his terminal. "Do you think we won?" he asked. General Adari didn't look away from the screen. "We didn't win anything," he said. "But they didn't erase it. And maybe that's enough for now. Because in a war without guns, memory was the front line. And the archive was a shield that only worked if enough people carried it. They weren't fighting to destroy anything. They were fighting to keep it visible." The chamber was colder than any courtroom had a right to be. It had no windows, no flags, no acoustics meant for speech. The walls were smooth, grey stone etched with unreadable glyphs, as if the very room had forgotten which language to bow to. There were no benches, no jury. Just a half-circle of tiers rising into darkness, dozens of platforms, each occupied by a different species, cloaked in ceremonial garb, biosuits, or nothing at all. The council gathered like gods who had forgotten they bled. The center of the floor was bare, a single podium, a single microphone. A door opened at the far end. Commander Tavrek Dolan stepped through, alone. No guards flanked him, no lawyers followed, no ceremonial escort announced his arrival. He walked with steady steps, back straight, eyes forward. His uniform bore no ribbons, no badges, just plain grey fabric, slightly worn from travel. His boots echoed with each stride, the sound swallowed into the silence like a question no one wanted to ask. He reached the podium and looked up. The lights shifted slightly as scanning systems activated across the chamber, an old formality. Truth readers, motion trackers, micro-expression monitors, all pointed at him. No one spoke until they did. From the third tier, a voice, dry, sharp like paper tearing, cut through the air. "State your designation for the record." "Tavrek Dolan, Commander, Kestel 9, Terran Interstellar Survey Division. Earth has been summoned under charges of subspace disruption, signal interference and cultural sabotage," the voice said. "Do you understand the severity of these accusations?" "I do," Dolan replied. "Do you deny them?" He didn't flinch. "I acknowledge the broadcast. I do not deny its contents, nor its intent." A ripple passed through the tiers. Not movement, but stillness. Deepening. Listening. Another voice, this one more polished, spoke next. "You bypassed council-controlled relays. You violated sanctioned data corridors. You embedded classified footage in public channels without council review. Do you claim this was justified?" "I don't claim anything," Dolan said. "I'll show you why it happened." He didn't wait for permission. With a tap of his finger on the console embedded into the podium, the room darkened. A screen rose behind him, wide, tall, colorless. No sound. Just a stream of images. Excavation fields, poles, ruins, and the bodies. He let it play in silence for 30 seconds before pausing it. "I found this on Jarak Theta, a sterilized world flagged as suitable for mineral reclamation. Our scanners picked up anomalies in the subsurface bedrock. My team excavated. We found not debris, but design. Not ruins, but remains." He changed the frame. Digital documents, identification sequences, cross-linked locations. "This isn't propaganda," he said. "It's a record." "Conveniently incomplete," one of the councillors interjected. "Everything you see is time-stamped by multiple systems, verified by our forensic teams. You can run your own analysis. He turned slightly, addressing the chamber. "But you already have." The silence that followed was not empty. It was defensive. Dolan continued, voice steady. "I reported this immediately, not to the public, not through open channels. I used Earth's diplomatic backline, a legacy pathway placed in Council registry under Article 12B. "You used a forbidden channel," another voice barked. "A dormant military-grade loop." He didn't argue. "I use a channel designed to survive censorship." No one corrected him. He moved to the next part of his presentation. Timelines. Packet traces. The Council's immediate blackout following Kestrel 9's transmission. The lockdown on Earth. The declaration of Emergency Protocol 88. "You silenced us," he said, "with no inquiry, no contact, no rebuttal." The screen shifted again. Footage from Earth's blackout. Billions of humans raising devices in unison, rooftops glowing in ritual silence, children holding screens, elders lighting candles. No riots, no slogans, just remembrance. "I didn't leak this," Dolan said. "I invoked a clause you ratified centuries ago." He tapped the final slide. Convention 17R. All members are permitted uninterrupted cultural transmission, regardless of status, trial, or sanction. Minimum time, 300 seconds. "Your own laws," he said. "Used as written." The council chamber held its breath. One of the older councillors, a reptilian diplomat who had served since before Earth joined as a probationary member, leaned forward. "And what exactly, Commander, do you consider to be Earth's cultural transmission in this case?" Dolan met his eyes without hesitation. "Memory," he said. No one moved. No rebuttals came. Even those most eager to pounce on protocol violations found themselves stalled by the weight of what had been shown. They could argue legality, but not gravity, not now. Not when so many of their own citizens had watched the footage, asked the same questions, lit their own screens in silent solidarity. Dolan leaned into the mic one last time. "You erased lives," he said quietly. "We remembered them." Then he stepped back. The screen behind him went black. No applause followed. This wasn't a gallery of approval, only the quiet mechanical blinking of the recording systems, capturing every breath, every twitch, every unreadable glance across species. No verdict was announced, not yet. The council did not speak again. They simply sat and watched. As history refused to look away, the council never issued a formal apology. They never admitted wrongdoing, never named the marshals who signed the sterilization orders, never addressed the documents shown across hundreds of systems. But they didn't need to. The silence was confirmation enough. What followed wasn't collapse, it was fracture. In the weeks after Dolan's trial, council members began withdrawing cooperation treaties, subcommittees failed to meet quorum, trade alliances shifted subtly, species that had long been silenced began speaking louder, entire networks restructured their architecture to avoid centralized relay approval. What had once been a monolith now groaned with fault lines. Earth didn't crow victory. There were no celebrations, no fireworks, no parades. Only quiet. The footage had already outlived the crisis. It had become a permanent fixture, a memory wired into systems too widespread to contain. It spread not as news, but as ritual. The Interstellar Council renamed Convention 17A. They didn't call it a concession, they called it a clarification. But on every legal record, on every update, it bore a new name. The Dolan Provision, a clause that no longer served only as ceremonial protection for cultural performance, but now carried the implicit right of remembrance, even in defiance of silence. It became a precedent. Other species invoked it. Former colonies unearthed their own hidden truths. Dissent wasn't a wave, it was a ripple, continuous, irreversible. The footage never aired on council channels again. But it didn't need to. Because Earth changed, and Earth remembered. Project Pharos was dismantled 6 months after the trial, not in secret, not quietly. The disassembly was streamed live, no narration, no government officials, just a single orbital feed showing the core lattice being removed, node by node, wire by wire, laid bare beneath a starlit sky. The final frame held for 10 minutes, a blank platform, quiet and empty, no weapons, no protest. Just absence. It was a message. We didn't build it to destroy. We built it to remember. Directive Echo was archived weeks later. The Orin technicians, some of whom had lived half their lives maintaining the forgotten web, gathered in the sea vault beneath the South Pacific. They stood in a narrow chamber carved into basalt, shells of copper-etched hardware arrayed like a shrine. One by one, they removed the servers, sealed them in carbon lock, and placed them into storage canisters marked for cultural preservation. They weren't buried in stone. They were lowered into the water. Some said it was symbolic, an echo going back where no signal could follow, a whisper left in the deep just in case the silence ever returned. No ceremony, no speech, only a plaque placed at the water's edge. Let the earth remember what the stars tried to forget. As for Tavrek Dolan, he vanished without farewell. He declined every interview, refused every award, ignored every message sent in the wake of his testimony. His last known location was the civilian transport bound for Saturn's moons. Witnesses claimed he wore no uniform, carried no baggage. He simply boarded, sat by the window, and watched the rings blur. No one knows where he is now. Some say he lives in a commune on Titan, teaching navigation to children. Others say he lives alone, farming kelp in methane lakes. A few believe he never left Jorak Theta at all. But he did leave one message. One final transmission to Earth's education system. No visuals, just voice. Don't remember me, he said. Remember them. It plays at the end of every history module taught in Earth's outer systems. Earth rewrote its laws. Quietly, carefully. On the first day of every month, across every time zone and every settlement, from the marble offices of New Tokyo to the domes of Virel Station, there is a pause, a signal pause. 4 minutes and 31 seconds. Every screen goes black. Every transmission stops. Every orbital relay falls silent. Hospitals prepare for it. Markets expect it. Ships navigate around it. No exceptions. The first time it happened, no one quite knew what to do. There were awkward silences in cafes. Journalists froze mid-broadcasts. Commuters paused halfway through subspace calls. But by the 3rd month, people began to plan for it. Not as obligation, as observance. In schools, children were brought out under skylights or to screen halls where glowing rectangles flickered to life, showing only stills. Not the worst ones, not the bodies, not the orders. Just the faces, drawn from forensic reconstructions, faded, alien, gone. Teachers didn't give lectures. There were no test questions, no debates, just silence. And at the end, each child was given one task. Write down a single word that described what they felt. Not what they thought, what they felt. Those words were collected, stored, archived. Some were simple, sad, scared, confused. Some were harder to name. Guilt, awe, weight, belonging. Through replays, some were only shapes, words not yet found in any language. And those words became part of Earth's living memorial. It wasn't about grief anymore. It was about space, in time, in systems, in hearts, for the ones who had no one left to speak for them. It was about showing the galaxy that remembrance was not defiance. It was dignity. No flags flew. No anthem played. Only light and pause. In the Great Archive at Carith Prime, a Council-Nemal planet home to the largest historical vault in known space, a new wing was added, no formal opening, just a quiet release. Inside, a wall bore the names of 2 species, not full names. They were never recovered. Just fragments, phonemes, shapes from broken dialect. And beneath those names, 2 lines etched in Terran steel. They tried to silence a file, we made it memory. And by the erased species, so we archived ghosts. It is said that every time a diplomat walks past that wall, their steps slow. And every time a child asks, "What does it mean?" the archivists reply the same way. "Sit down. Let me tell you a story. And when I'm done, you hold it so it never disappears again." Did this story shake something inside you? What would you have done in Dolan's place? Do you believe silence can ever be more powerful than war? Comment below with your thoughts. Your words are part of the memory now. We read every one. And if you crave more thrilling HFY stories, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what's coming next.